Our next guest knows all about the limitations of the press and of the media. He is an historian, columnist, and one of the great media barons of the last few decades, who was for a time the third biggest newspaper magnate in the world. And at various times he has owned Britain's Daily Telegraph, the Chicago Sun-Times, the Jerusalem Post, the Spectator, of which I'm the Australian editor, and even our own Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, and the Australian Financial Review papers. Indeed, his intimate knowledge of the journalistic profession at one point led him to describe journalists as swarming, grunting masses of jackals. A prolific and highly respected writer himself, he has published many articles and books, including biographies of Richard Nixon and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and is renowned for his historical writings as well, including a complete history of his homeland of Canada. Last year, he published his third presidential biography, Donald J. Trump, A President Like No Other, writing that Trump is not, in fact, a racist, sexist, warmonger, hothead, promoter of violence, or a foreign or domestic economic warrior. Absolutely. He must have been watching Outsiders, because that's exactly what we think too. Our guest, who has also published not one but two autobiographies, is also a British peer, and his official title is better than anything on Game of Thrones. It's Lord Black of Crossharbour. He also spent 3 years in prison, having been convicted of financial fraud, and since being released has fought to clear his name, and indeed, much to the horror of the lovies, he was pardoned earlier this year by none other than US President Donald Trump, and he had many of the convictions overturned by other courts. Living in Toronto, he currently writes for the National Post and has just penned an excellent piece about the green terror of the climate change cult. Conrad Black, welcome to Outsiders.
Thank you very much, Rowan, and I want to congratulate Rita on her brilliant and inspiriting comment. I unfortunately have to tell her that, as she probably knows, her inveighings against public broadcasting in Australia are not confined to Australia and are not confined to public broadcasting. But it was a most uplifting comment.
Thank you.
Excellent. Now, Conrad, we'll talk, there's so much we could talk about, but just take us through your recent article on the green terror gripping the world. Climate change, obviously. Give us your thoughts on that.
Rowan, I think it's actually, I'm pleased to say this, in retreat. I mean, your country has been an inspiring illustration of that in your recent election. As I understand it, the climate issue was a significant issue there, and the country rejected it as a false attempt to frighten the people and take self-punitive, economically unjustified decisions to placate a phantom danger. I think Japan has essentially taken the same course. The United States has done the same. And as we all know, the greatest polluters, the Chinese and the Indians, are also racking up the the largest, the fastest economic growth rates of any of the 50 large economies, and they are simply accusing the West of hypocrisy in having engaged in the activities they are now engaging in to enjoy the benefits of prosperity. So the climatists, the climate terrorists, are being confined steadily by the fact that the terrible thing isn't happening. You know, the warming isn't happening. The first 15 years of this century were cooler than the last 15 years of the last century. And they can only play this out so long, and they're getting more and more desperate. And an illustration of that is sending this 15-year-old Swedish girl around like a sort of non-violent, atheistic Saint Joan of Arc to terrorize the world that the end is nigh. But it's nonsense. And the scientific solidarity is fragmenting, and the surest sign of that is that the International Panel on Climate Change, which really got the whole thing going under the aegis of the United Nations, is now on the heels of its terrible setbacks about Himalayan glacier melting, which hasn't happened, and the proverbial hockey stick of a 45-degree rise in warming, which has not happened. is now actually framing its warnings in relatively judicious and cautious terms. So they're cooling out, and so those who bet everything, put all their chips on this chimera, this nonsense, are becoming more desperate. And in the abstract, it's sort of amusing to watch, but unfortunately too many people still take it seriously. Of course we have to be vigilant, and I don't want any of your viewers to think I'm blasé about pollution. I'm not. But the idea that the climate is about to put Venice 50 feet underwater, or turn us all into snowmen or something, this is not happening.
James.
Conrad Black, you were recently pardoned, as we talked about before, by Donald Trump, but it should be noted that in 2010, the Supreme Court, after a series of appeals, kicked back by a 9-0 verdict many of your original convictions on some financial charges. You wrote in your biography, A Matter of Principle, very eloquently about the way in which you were pursued by the federal prosecutors in a very Javert-like fashion in a jurisdiction that had over a 90% conviction rate. Having seen the behavior of the federal government in your case, do you see something similar happening with the way some elements of the federal government in the U.S. are pursuing Donald Trump? Would you say that you've had sort of a bit of a taste of that deep state treatment yourself?
I would want to be careful about mind reading what people I don't know well are doing, and I would want to be careful about a facile comparison. But I think that I can answer yes to this extent. And incidentally, just in case anyone didn't understand the exact meaning of what you said, all of the counts, all of the counts against me were either abandoned, rejected by jurors, or, as you said, unanimously rejected by the Supreme Court. 2 were spuriously received, but under international legal standards, in fact, the retrieval of them was invalid because the local jurisdiction and the presiding trial judge both said that the 2 that were retrieved were in fact not guilty results. But I don't want to be technical. I just want to make it clear that I don't owe my status as a not guilty person entirely to the president, but I was grateful to him for what he did. And when he called me about this, we did touch upon the fact that his tormentors are led in some measure by the people who persecuted me. Comey and Fitzgerald is now Comey's lawyer. He was my prosecutor. We caught the prosecution every day lying to the court. There was never any sanction for it. And what I would say, I don't use the phrase deep state, but the political class of America it just became, it congealed in a kind of bipartisan 2 terms for each party in the White House, but a bipartisan congealed mass governing for the benefit of themselves. And the country declined terribly between the retirement of President Reagan and the accession of President Trump. And it was the worst 20 years. I'll leave out President Bush Sr., who was a holding operation that was not unsuccessful. He wasn't a strong leader, but he was a distinguished man, and it wasn't a bad time. But after that, it was the worst 20 years of presidential misgovernment in the history of the United States, worse than the 10 years before the Civil War, and worse than the years between President Wilson and President Franklin Roosevelt, when we had isolationism, prohibition, the underworld taking over the alcoholic beverages industry, and as a final crowning achievement, the Great Depression. And what we had before Trump and between Reagan and Trump was worse than that. And Trump is cleaning it up. And he meant what he said. And we must remember, in fairness to him, and to maintain the patience required, he ran against all factions of both parties, ran against the entire political class. He ran against the Bushes as much as the Clintons and Obama, and it takes a long time to clean it out. The Republican leaders in the Congress sat in their hands for the first 6 months he was president, but he is now in absolute control of that party, and he is going to win, and he's going to take the Congress back.
Fantastic. Conrad, I just want to quickly ask you, you were famously Boris Johnson's boss when he was writing in Britain, and you owned, as I said before, many newspapers, including The Spectator. Tell us your thoughts about Boris's Machiavellian approach to Brexit, and do you think he'll win the election, and then what will happen with Brexit? How successful will he be? Thanks, Conrad.
Well, thank you. I note that I'm pleased to be remembered at all in Australia, which is a country I love and have fond memories of and get back when I can. But I note I'm remembered as Donald Trump's former business partner and Boris Johnson's former employer, and both of which roles I enjoyed. On the election in the UK, I think Boris will win quite comfortably. I think after the greatest failure in British governmental history since the American Revolution, finally that system produced an admirable compromise. Britain won't leave without an agreement. It has an agreement it can live with, an agreement that's already been twice approved through second reading by the former Parliament, which was on this issue completely incapable of any agreement on anything. And so the Leave majority in the referendum wins, and if you superimpose the electoral map on the referendum result, over 400 constituencies voted to leave. That party, though it was a close popular vote, wins, but there is an agreement that will maintain good relations with Europe and preserve the best of that association. And I think Boris was the man and the only man to slice the Gordian knot, and I think he's going to see it through very well. And effectively, what you have is one and a half Leave parties against 5 Remain parties. So it's a heavily divided electorate on the other side. And I think Boris will pass through the middle with a little over 40% of the vote. But I would think a parliamentary majority of at least 40 MPs.
Lord Conrad Black, thank you so much for being on Outsiders today. An absolute honour to get your insights on so many issues. Thank you so much for being on Outsiders.